Well, honestly, PTSD can be derived from any significant trauma that forces a permanent behavioral, change. So, for example, I know somebody who grew up, in the ghetto in Cleveland, and he was the star football player. He was going to the NFL. This was his ticket for him and his whole family. And he got injured, like senior year, a couple games before the last game of the season. He couldn't play in college, so he lost his college scholarship. He's never going to go to the NFL. And he's working at a grocery store, stocking shelves.
Jonathan Lubecky has extensive experience in multiple subject areas, both within the United States and internationally. Originally serving in both the Marine Corps and medically retired from the Army after serving a combat tour in Iraq in 2006. John is an honors graduate of the Citadel with degrees in political science, Middle East history, and intelligence analysis, graduating in 2015. He has worked on campaigns from school board to president and every office in between. Pivoting from campaign work, John became an advocate for psychedelic-assisted therapy after it cured his PTSD. In pursuit of his goal to help those who he served with to heal from PTSD, he has passed several pieces of legislation on the state, federal, and international level, to include having the Department of Defense and Veterans Administration investigative psychedelic treatments, as well as helping to create the Bipartisan Path Caucus. He also has extensive media experience appearing in a Webby Award-winning economist video, beating out a Marvel film. That's amazing. And appearing in 3 #1 Netflix series, Goop Labs, Business of Drugs, and How to Change Your Mind, as well as debates on rising and breaking points. In John's spare time, he travels to Ukraine to provide humanitarian and medical aid to civilians who reside near the ongoing fighting. He also works in advocacy involving psychedelic-assisted therapy in the United Nations and across Europe. While hailing from Cleveland and residing in the Carolinas or overseas, his adult life, he currently resides in Washington, D.C. with his adorable Boykin Spaniel, Her Royal Highness Princess Rebecca II of South Carolina, better known as Becca. Love the last touch. That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, John, thank you for hopping on tonight. We, once again, I know we've kind of talked about this back and forth, and even before starting the recording, talked about how much there is to discuss. So I really appreciate you hopping on, taking the time to speak about everything that's going on, from psychedelics to Ukraine and everything in between. But if you wouldn't mind just starting off, I'd love to learn a little bit more about the military history and background, which I kind of think leads into a lot of these topics pretty well. So can we start there, and then we'll progress into the rest of the conversation?
Yeah. So, growing up, I always knew I was going to be in the military. Always wanted to fly. So because of that, the easiest way for unless you're born rich to go fly is the military. Unfortunately, I had horrible eyesight. So I figured, well, if I can't be a pilot, at least I can work on airplanes. So, you know, between my junior and senior year, had the different recruiters come talk to me. My brother was in the Marine Corps. And so I was like, they got cool uniforms. Being a Marine's a badass thing. So I joined the Marine Corps to go work on airplanes. And very fortunately, when I got to Memphis, Tennessee, uh, I was assigned to be a parachute rigger, meaning I was going to pack parachutes. And I'm like, that's not working on airplanes. So they gave me an opportunity to go be a loadmaster on C-130s. So I went through aircrew school and rode around on C-130s, visited dozens of countries, lived in Japan for a year. One of the biggest things more Americans need to do is get the hell out of America. I mean, I love this country. It's a great place. You don't realize how great things are here until you leave here. Um, and there's also tons of cool shit you can see all around the world that doesn't exist here. I mean, look, we're not that old a country. Unless you're getting into indigenous ruins and stuff down in Mexico, our stuff's what, 250, 300 years old. You might have something 400 years old in Charleston.
Right.
They've got castles that have been in the same family for 1,500 years.
I hear the argument all the time, though. People will say, I'm not traveling because there's so much to do in the US. And I've heard Europeans say that too. They're like, why would you travel anywhere else? I mean, when you have all this stuff in the US. But to your point, it definitely expands and provides you a different perspective, for sure.
And, most people, well, a lot of people go off to college. Or if they don't go to college, They get a job at like McDonald's or Walmart or something. They're not one of the best things the military gave me was I got to experience different cultures and I got to learn about different cultures and interact with different cultures that were very different than mine. Um, being in Japan, I don't speak Japanese. If I said thank you in Japanese, they were ecstatic. Compare that to the United States, where if you have an accent, some Americans will get pissy at you.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Or they just don't understand you, especially like if you're in the Northeast and you have a Southern drawl, they don't understand it at
exactly.
all.
I mean, we have arguments over accents amongst ourselves here. And just going out and exploring the world gives you a better perspective on life, especially like in the day of politics where everybody's talking about geopolitics.
Yeah.
When most people, we're going to talk about Ukraine, and most people couldn't point to Ukraine on a map, let alone tell you anything about its history over the past 100 years. And you have people making decisions where people, you know, sitting around the bar or sitting around Thanksgiving table making decisions, making statements when they've never been outside the US, or the people who've never been out of the Tri-County area
Yeah.
except for their honeymoon to Myrtle Beach. They've never left the state of South Carolina.
How do you typically handle those kind of people and just in general, whenever you're having a conversation and you've just gotten back from Ukraine, you've been abroad, you've experienced these things, but you're also, frankly trying to be a humble individual with all of your experiences. How do you typically approach those conversations with folks that just truly don't know what they're talking about because they have not either been there, they're just listening to Fox, they're just listening to CNN, once again, they're just listening to the media. They actually haven't experienced it. How do you communicate with those folks?
Well, so it's not as bad in DC as it is in, say, Charleston, in part because people in DC, most of the people I hang out with, the bars I go to, they all work in politics. So they
Right.
all at least have some measure of knowledge on it. What's really interesting is the people, there's an argument. I don't necessarily agree with it, but there is an argument that the US should not be funding this. We should be spending our tax dollars in the US. That is a wholly separate question from whether the Ukraine war is a just war or not. And I find it interesting that people who believe whether the US should financially support a war or not determines whether something is a just war or not. I mean, whether the US financially supports Ukraine, Ukraine got invaded by Russia, that should not have happened.
Right.
And they're fighting for their own defense. It's really interesting the people who combine those two things. The US should not support it, therefore Russia should win.
So your opinion is there's a bit of a gray area, whereas there's a lot of opinions that I hear on a daily basis. It's either pro or against, right? But there's a very gray area that it sounds like you kind of exist in, correct?
Oh, very much so. There's
Okay.
not a lot of conservatives or right leaning people who work in psychedelics and who support Ukraine. Um,
A little bit of an outlier, would you say?
yeah, but it's a weird perspective, and it's led to a lot of great success,
Yeah.
which is a good thing. But
We
when I
know
talk about
and frankly, we just mentioned this though. You've been on, I mean, obviously you've been in 3 Netflix series. You've been on Dr. Phil with Dan Crenshaw. You've done all these things across the board, right? And also it seems like a lot of conservatives are starting to get behind the psychedelic movement. Well, more conservatives are starting to get behind the psychedelic movement. I'm assuming that's due in part to a lot of your work and also others in this space. Once again, we're jumping around to a bunch of different topics right now. So I love how this
I've
is
got it.
starting off.
Yeah, I've
This
got
is absolutely
ADHD, so
amazing.
this is how conversations always go with me.
No, this is phenomenal. So I'm going to go back to real quick before we go there because
Yeah,
I forgot we got Ukraine towards the end for us, and I've got psychedelics as a section all together. I do want to be after your just because this will lead well into it with your experience in the military and then going and getting your degree and then what led you into psychedelics and everything else. But post your experience in the military, I guess when did you find so a lot of treatments for PTSD, right? A lot of
yeah.
treatments don't work for certain individuals, which has obviously led you to psychedelics. When did you find psychedelics as a treatment option for yourself?
So, um, I by accident, honestly. So in 2014, while I was at the Citadel, I had a suicide attempt and slit my wrist open. Went and I will say this, the Citadel handled that fantastically. Every one of my professors, the school, everybody handled it perfectly. I couldn't have asked for better. But so I was hospitalized, and one of the things that I told the VA I needed was weekly therapy sessions, because all those different treatments for PTSD, the VA had tried them on me. At one point, I was on 42 separate pills a day. Talk therapy, all the different whiz bang things they tried, nothing worked. Some things would work temporarily, especially medications, but I would always either build a tolerance, they'd stop working, side effects would become, horrible. But had an intern from MUSC filling in for my doc for one of my mental health appointments. Because it was an intern, they were one of the first people to go through my whole medical file in a long time. So she slides this note across the desk and says, "Hey, don't look at this until after you leave, because I'm not supposed to tell you about this." And I'm like, okay, what is this? Is she hitting on me? Is this a phone number? Like, I open it up and it says Google MDMA PTSD. And so, like, okay, so I did, and I found out that MDMA had been shown to help people with PTSD, and there was a clinical trial going on in Mount Pleasant, right across the bridge.
Wow.
So I called up. At the time, it was MAPS PBC. It's now called Lycos Therapeutics. I said, "Hey, I live in Charleston. I'm batshit crazy." They're like, they're very left wing. They're like, we don't like using that kind of language, and so they're like, "What do you mean by that?" And I tell them, they're like, "Oh, you're exactly our kind of batshit crazy." So,
Funny, but not funny. Yeah.
yeah. So it turns out that one person had dropped out of the trial because after one or two sessions, they felt they didn't need to continue. So they were able to expand the 25-person veteran and first responder trial to include me. So I was the 26th person in a 25-person trial. There's a lot of, it's been a long, weird journey where I lost my religion when I was in Iraq, but I also now can't deny a higher power given all the crazy town stuff that's happened in my life. There aren't a lot of people who put a gun to their head twice and pulled the trigger and live. Same with slitting wrists, the divine intervention that has put me on the weird path I'm on, and to include the military and giving me a sense of wanting to do something greater than myself.
Yeah.
You know, it's actually one of the reasons I love going to the Citadel, because not only did I go to college, but I mentored cadets that wanted to, and I always found that enjoyable. But that's how I found out about it. So I actually did my MDMA therapy my senior year at the Citadel. I'm pretty sure I'm not the first graduate of the Citadel to trip balls during their
Yeah.
senior year. I'm probably
That was my question was, well, what were they? I guess they weren't drug testing as a graduate in the graduate program. Like
right.
were they not drug testing?
No, we didn't.
Yeah.
We
So I guess
yeah,
that was
we didn't
not
have
a part
any.
of it.
We had no rules like that.
Yeah.
But also, here's the funny thing: even though if I was drug tested, because this was done under an FDA protocol with
Right.
full federal government permission, I got a business card that said this individual will test positive for drugs of abuse. He's a participant in a clinical trial. If you have questions, call the Drug Enforcement Administration at a 1-800 number, and it says reference study number and had two different numbers on it. To verify. So I legally did MDMA. As a matter of fact, the MDMA I took, I got to meet the guy who made it in the 80s for the DEA, because the DEA is the one who supplied the MDMA for the phase 2 trial. And I took my first dose November 22nd, 2014. So almost exactly 10 years ago. I had PTSD for 8 years. I refratted from Iraq November 22nd, 2014. Again, there's weird alignments that are very strange. So I had PTSD for exactly 8 years. I'm one of the few people who can say I've been healed of it longer than I had it.
It's amazing.
And even before I started going to Ukraine, there was some weird stuff. There's a guy who drowned in the lake behind my house, dove in, pulled him out. Then there was a shooting victim in downtown Charleston that I was involved in, which, by the way, I'm apparently on a body camera video on IDTV on some weird thing because of that one. Um, and so I didn't have, like, I talked to a counselor, but I didn't have PTSD. I didn't have the same issues I had when I came back from Iraq.
Right.
And so I realized how much it changed my life and wanted it for the guys I served with and for honestly everybody who has PTSD, not just veterans, but domestic violence survivors, rape victims, all the people who have the millions of people in this country who have PTSD.
Right. So can you expand on that real quick? Because I think a lot of the vast majority of people, when they think PTSD, they think military service or first responder of some kind. So can you just kind of give a broader understanding of what PTSD can be derived from?
Well, honestly, PTSD can be derived from any significant trauma that forces a permanent behavioral, change. So, for example, I know somebody who grew up, in the ghetto you know, in Cleveland, and he was the star football player. He was going to the NFL. This was his ticket for him and his whole family. And he got injured, like senior year, a couple games before the last game of the season, and he couldn't play in college, so he lost his college scholarship. Was never going to go to the NFL, and he's working at a grocery store, stocking shelves. He actually, believe it or not, has clinically diagnosed PTSD from that injury because it created such a trauma. It can come from combat. One of the things that's interesting about veterans, we all hate getting that stigma of having PTSD because it's a scarlet letter, in part because it's typically viewed as being a permanent thing. It's
Right.
an acquired mental illness that once acquired is your new normal. They can mitigate symptoms, but it's with you for forever. And it's been hard for me to actually convince people that I don't have PTSD because they think I'm like faking it. Um, but even as much as veterans hate saying we have PTSD, nobody questions my PTSD. If I talk to a legislator, if I talk to anybody on the street, no matter if I talk to a news outlet, and I say, hey, my name's John Lubecky. I did, you know, 12 years in the military and I served in Iraq and I came home with PTSD. They all nod their head yes, because that's what people think of.
Right.
Well, if it's about domestic violence, it's, well, why didn't you leave sooner? If it's a rape victim, well, were you drunk? Why didn't you report it? There's no questioning the PTSD of a veteran. So we have the ability to actually talk about it more than others without putting ourselves at as much emotional risk
Got it.
of being judged.
You this is kind of a follow-up and going back a little bit, but you mentioned earlier the suicide attempts at the Citadel and maybe post as
Yeah,
well.
definitely trigger warning on anything I say.
Yeah. Well, I would say those particular situations, you now talk about them openly. How long did it take for you to be able to talk about them openly in this journey? And I feel like a lot of people still you're obviously a very open individual, and that's why we're having this conversation. But a lot of people still don't have the ability to open up. And I say a lot of guys don't have the ability to open up because I just know plenty of guys who'd like to bottle it up and don't talk about things. But what is kind of at what point were you in this process were you able to start sharing this experience to really open up and help others as well?
So I actually got my first bill passed in 2009 in North Carolina. Um, I went to the hospital instead of going to work, so I did not kill myself. That freaked out my employer, and they fired me. Took me 9 months to get an appeal for my unemployment. I ended up winning. I asked the adjudicator, why did this have to wait 9 months? Because it's what the law says. Showed me the law. I sat down. I wrote my first bill in North Carolina. It passed 3 months later. I actually started talking publicly about PTSD then because I realized that I had to get the bill passed. But I didn't do like interviews and things like that. And then about a year after, was sitting at a bar, and this guy was talking about who was a veteran, because if you run into a veteran, you just end up talking to each other if you're in a bar by yourself.
Yeah.
And so uh, he was mentioning how he had gotten fired because, all right, he punched his boss, but his boss came up behind him and was popping balloons just to get a reaction. So he gets why he understands why he was fired, but he thought unemployment would be an issue, and it wasn't because of the bill I got passed.
Gotcha.
And that's kind of when I realized that, hey, if I get involved in politics and I pass bills, I can affect everybody. And so I realized that just being honest and talking about it
Right.
was helpful. And the whole time I was at the Citadel, and even when I was in North Carolina before that, I was working on medical cannabis. And so I had already talked a lot about, the suicidal ideation. I just never thought I'd take anything that freaking cured me, because I believed the lie that once you have PTSD, it's always with you.
Right. With like the MDMA, and you mentioned tripping balls at the Citadel. But when you were taking it, were you I'm just to better understand, were you microdosing it? How did that work? And did you start off on a higher dose and they kind of brought you down over time? Can you kind of walk
Well,
through?
I've only taken MDMA 3 times in my life, and it was
Okay,
as part of the trial in 2014, 2015.
got it.
Um, I mean, it's not like it's not offered to me constantly, but I don't need to take it, so I don't. And I view it as a medicine, and recreational use confuses the whole medical argument. But with MDMA, because the A at the end stands for amphetamine, you actually can't microdose MDMA. If you do, it's basically taking Adderall.
Got it.
You have to have a certain concentration to start getting the more hypnotic effects. So I did 8 hours of psychotherapy under the influence of 125 milligrams of pure MDMA with a 62.5 milligram booster dose 2 hours in. The 2 hours in, it doesn't make you more stoned or make you roll more. It just extends the therapeutic range, because the goal of MDMA is to actually do talk therapy for hours on end. Um, but most people that have PTSD, when they do therapy, they either get over emotional and so they can't process, or they get under emotional and their emotions shut off and they can't process. So what the MDMA does is helps keep you in that happy medium section where your brain can process. It also shuts off your amygdala, which is your fear response, heightens your prefrontal cortex, which is your emotional processing, and makes you love everyone around you, including the therapist. So you're able, so it's a tool to make the therapy work.
Got it.
It's not like, for example, if you get strep throat and you go to the doctor, they're going to give you antibiotics. The antibiotics, you take them, they kill the infection, you're all better. That's not how this works. And part of the problem you have in the psychedelic space is the psychedelic movement, which is very much interested in legalizing psychedelics for any context of use. And a lot of them also want to end the drug war, have made it more about the drugs. Um, if you just take these, it will fix you. And that's not true. If you're not doing therapy, you're just doing drugs. I don't think people should go to jail for doing drugs, but I also don't think people, doing mushrooms and going to a fish concert should call that medicine either.
Right. So you mentioned you've done it 3 times, this particular therapy, correct?
Correct.
Have you done anything else psychedelically, therapeutically since then? And also, like, what has that been like? Has it been a continuation of sorts or completely different or what?
So I smoke cannabis.
Okay.
Um, to be honest, that's mostly because I turned 48 at the end of this month, and due to my military service, my joints and everything suck, and I'd much rather smoke a joint than take Advil and opiates.
Got it.
Seems a lot better for my liver, although way worse for my lungs. Um, as far as psychedelics, taken medicinally, no. It shocks people when I tell them, like, everybody assumes I've done every psychedelic known to man. And when they find out, like, for example, I've not done LSD, everybody freaks out. They're like, wait, you're like the psychedelic poster child. How have you not done LSD?
Yeah.
But I've done ayahuasca twice as part of a ceremony here in DC. Um, to be honest, it did nothing for me. I got a little chilly and that was it. And I watched people puke and shit and it was not fun.
Yeah.
And then I worked on Initiative 81 here in DC, which decriminalized plant-based psychedelics in DC, which I regret working on Initiative 81. Um,
And why is
they
that?
So one of the things is, as a veteran, they promised me that all these different therapists were going to be helping veterans, and this was going to become available as a treatment in DC. That never happened because it was entirely about, having weed delivery services and shops sell mushrooms. And now here we are a few years later, and most of the psilocybin chocolate bars sold in DC don't contain any psilocybin. There are these other chemicals. As a matter of fact, there's an article, I'll send it to you, where in Los Angeles, they seized 14 tons of psilocybin chocolate bars that all had DET as a chemical compound rather than actual psilocybin.
Hmm.
Because this is the problem with decrim. It takes everything that's wrong with the underground market for drugs and just says it makes it worse, and you don't go to jail for it.
Yeah. I've had this conversation a lot with friends as of late where it's like, hey, if you even wanted to try something, you're too scared to try it anymore with all the stories you hear about people, specifically fentanyl and like every single kind of drug, right?
Dude, I have
Yeah.
Narcan over my sink, and
Yeah.
I have Narcan in my car and in my first aid kit and all of this. And fentanyl is a really interesting. Um, it's an American phenomenon. Um, the EU, which is about the same size as the US, has similar drug use habits. They had 10,000 fentanyl overdoses. We had 120,000. It's not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I can point you to where the DEA says this too. This is Chinese narco warfare. They're fighting the opium wars in reverse, and it's laying waste to the military age population of this country.
Very sadly. Very sad.
And this is where I was reading, you know, Vivek Ramaswamy got hit because he supports legalizing weed, which is a smart decision at this point, especially just to take it off the table politically so Democrats can't just hold that fishing rod out every election. Vote for us and we'll legalize weed. We really
Yeah.
mean it this time. They've been saying that since '92. But they plan on expanding the DEA. And what's funny is the counterculture left thinks that's because they're going to go after psychedelics and weed. No, they're going after fentanyl.
Right. Right. Well, there's a huge need for more enforcement on that particular issue. Um, and
But
less.
also, fentanyl has this is the thing. And this is actually a tie in perfectly with psychedelics. Fentanyl has a medicinal use. Um, Last August, when I had back surgery, because I work in drug policy, I had fun conversations with the anesthesiologist. And we did a little experiment, which was he was going to tell me everything he gave me. And then in recovery, he was going to ask me the last thing I remembered. Um, and so the first compound they gave me for anesthesia was fentanyl, but it was under direct supervision with a specially trained, you know, person who wasn't doing the substance themselves.
Right.
And so when it comes to medicinal use of psychedelics, it's the same thing. This isn't something you should do at home because it can lead to drastically horrible consequences.
Right.
But if you have mental health issues, doing it with a therapist who's properly trained can change your life, and they do work. I
I
mean,
think
you can cut suicides in half in this country.
one of my biggest issues when people start talking about drugs of any kind is when they act like they know what they're talking about as it pertains to that drug, right? When they just do not, right? Obviously, COVID, I think, made us all aware of that, right? Where people would start talking about things that they just had no idea what they were referring to at all. And then they'd start spouting off information, facts, things they'd read online, etc. And I think that in of itself has kind of opened me up to, wow, I've thought this about these particular drugs my entire life. I actually have no idea. And thinking of the fact that, okay, we can use fentanyl for good things, or for anesthesia specifically, but also we know that it's people, plenty of people are overdosing, 100,000 plus a year are overdosing and dying from it. Also not phenomenal, not a great stat. We really need to work on that. But there's both sides to the story, right? Where it's like you don't just completely outlaw it because we do know for a fact that it does have good usages, but at the same time, it also is terrible in other ways.
Well,
So,
this is where we need to reframe how we think about this. So, like, I grew up in the Dare generation because I'm an old man, and back in the Dare generation, you had good drugs and bad drugs. Well, you know what? Good drugs gave us the opiate epidemic, and bad drugs cured my PTSD. So it's not good drugs or bad drugs. All drugs are just compounds. They're tools. It's context of use, whether it's good or bad,
yeah,
whether it's encouraged or discouraged, whether it's responsible or irresponsible use. And this is where, especially when it comes to psychedelic policy, it gets very difficult when most of the psychedelic movement just wants to legalize drugs. And so all context is considered medicinal and spiritual. And it's kind of funny when you start after, like, do you want to do a ceremony with sacred plants? And I'm like, well, since this sacred ceremony with these sacred plants, you wouldn't sully it with asking, charging a fee, would you? Well, the knowledge carriers should be paid for their time. I'm like, yeah, you're a drug dealer who learned magic words to make it not sound like you're a drug dealer.
yeah. So
And
you're the
hold one
psychedelic guy.
second.
You're the pro responsible use of psychedelics guy.
Yes, absolutely.
The
And I'm
pro
going to be,
responsible usage of psychedelics, which once again, I feel like when you're labeled a psychedelic guy, people immediately think that you're all about legalizing everything across the board and just use as much of it as you want. But
and I
that's
mean, I do
obviously
have
not
psychedelic shoes and stuff.
pretty
So,
pretty dope shoes though, for being honest.
well, what's really funny is when I throw on a nice Brooks Brothers suit to go to an event and I toss those shoes on, it's my little bit of psychedelic flair.
Throws everybody off. They're like,
Oh
"Oh,
yeah,
you're that guy." So,
but it is about responsible use.
yeah,
And this is why conservatives are on board for it. You've got we've shown that psilocybin has breakthrough therapy designation for depression, a couple different forms of depression, MDMA for PTSD. I don't know how else I can prove that this shit works, at least for me. And I haven't done it for 10 years. And that's going back to that your question. I have done mushrooms a few times recreationally
yeah.
after Initiative 81 passed, but I mean, I'll stick with weed and cigarettes. Honestly, I don't need to trip all the time. Like this, the whole point of this is to reset everything and allow you to learn how to process trauma properly.
Right.
At some point we'll get to the Ukraine. I've seen far worse in Ukraine than I ever saw in my year in Iraq, and I don't have PTSD.
I'm not trying to like leave the second half of this conversation. Well, I kind of am. I think the second half of this conversation podcast is going to be all about Ukraine. So I'm not trying to like steer away from those
Oh
right now.
no, no, you're fine.
Plenty to discuss about psychedelics and Netflix and all the above first. As kind of a follow up to that, statistically speaking, because I'm sure you know the numbers, what are kind of the results of the, let's just say the MDMA test trial?
So part of the issue with that is the FDA believed that the data was unreliable. Um,
Because everybody was high? Was that, what was what
well,
was
part
the
of it
reasoning?
was they didn't collect adverse events or these things called positive adverse events, which is did people get high? Um, and there were some complications with blinding and a few other things. So basically, the short version is the FDA believed that because activists were the ones doing the trials, that activists put their finger on the scale of science. So the results from the trials are 70% no longer qualifies having PTSD. Now, the interesting thing is with the Crenshaw Amendment having passed and DOD about to issue $4.8 million grant for MDMA and $4.8 million grant for psilocybin to treat active duty with PTSD and depression, respectively. Um, nobody's going to call the DoD a bunch of hippie activists. Um, and so when their results, which they were forced to do, they were drugged, kicking and screaming by Congressman Crenshaw, um, to do this. It's going to be hard for anybody to question whether it works as a medicine.
Right.
Then it becomes, how do we integrate that? And that's the biggest problem, is when it became about the movement, when it became about the drugs, nobody trusts the science. Now, do I think that DOD is going to get 70%? It could actually be higher, because there's a bias that'll be built into their study that's really hard to nullify. And that is, all the people doing it are going to want to do this to save their career.
Got it.
So it could be higher than 70%. It could be lower than 70%, because DOD doesn't really want it to work. But even if it's 50%, that's 2.5 times the current rate of treatment available. And so what the actual percentages are, I don't know. I know N of one, me, 100%. But I also know this doesn't work for everybody. And, especially don't go do this by yourself, and think that you're going to have the results that I've had.
Yeah.
Because you won't. But, the more the VA does this, I find it funny that within 10 years, we went from an intern at the VA sliding a piece of paper across saying, I can't tell you about this, to there's 7 or 8 different VAs that are conducting independent trials using either psilocybin or MDMA. And I sat down and did a 40-minute podcast with the Undersecretary of Health, Dr. Sharif Elmenhall, who's a huge supporter of it now.
Yeah.
But the thing
at what
is,
point do people realize that the other options are not working? I guess is my question, right? When you've got plenty
everybody
of people
admits that part. That's the easy part, honestly. Everybody knows there's a problem. The question is the danger of authorizing this greater than the societal impact of PTSD? And when you have things like how we've seen ketamine rolled out,
yeah,
where they're mailing ketamine to people and saying, we trust you, journal when you do ketamine, don't take it when you go to the concert. And that's how they want MDMA. And curtailing off-label use will fix a lot of problems. I think curtailing off-label use would make the FDA and the government far more comfortable authorizing other Schedule I narcotics for medical use.
right. You mentioned Congressman Crenshaw.
Yeah.
How many congressmen and women are on board with this? Is there like a percentage you would say?
So recent, probably the best data on that is recently, before the FDA decision, 80 members of the House and Senate signed a letter in support of approving psychedelics for mental health.
Got it.
So it's a sizable chunk, and that's just who is willing to sign the letter, not those who show sympathies, but it's not going to play well back in the home district.
Got it.
So, but having the psychedelic caucus, which is Noah's Ark style, so every Democrat has to bring a Republican, every Republican has to bring a Democrat. The weird part is, and I don't know how it'll be in the new Congress, but for this Congress, we've had Republicans stacked up like cordwood that can't get Democrats to join, in part because the only Democrats who want to join are people like Blumenauer and AOC. We don't want firebrands. That's why, for example, Matt Gaetz is not a member. We don't want that kind of person, because we want this to, the purpose of the caucus is essentially to put guardrails on the medicine aspect and to separate it from the greater psychedelic movement and the art and all the hippy dippy stuff.
Yeah. Which is definitely I'll let people decide for themselves. Seems like a good approach, though, especially if you're going to start introducing it into society. Might as well not take off the guardrails altogether. Might as well slowly introduce it to figure out what works and what doesn't, which is always interesting to me with friends of mine. And we have this conversation that I'd say that the hardcore libertarians specifically, who were like, why is any of it illegal? And you're kind of like, well, because there's obviously a negative impact of certain things.
And when you're talking about weed, which has a minimal negative impact, it's one thing. When you're talking about meth and people shooting up in parks, that's a different story.
Correct. Like, I don't really want to like drive by and see people shooting a meth or taking heroin or doing whatever they're doing, right? Like I don't really care to be around that on a day-to-day basis. I don't think we want our kids to be around that either, which I don't have kids yet, but I don't think we want children around that specifically. And you just open up a whole other can of worms altogether. As a follow-up to that, a lot of this has been very political, but then this has also led to you being in 3 Netflix series as well. How did you who connected you with Netflix? How did you get connected with the producers of these shows, series, etc.? Can we kind of just talk through that timeline of sort of when you got involved there?
Yeah, my whole career has been an accident. I didn't intend for any of it.
Is it? Well, yeah.
So I started talking. So after graduation, I went and I worked on Rand Paul's presidential campaign. And so when you're at events waiting for like Rand Paul or whoever, Tim Scott,
Yeah.
to get up on stage and talk, at every event you have all the same media people, but you can't talk about work because that's the campaign and that'll end up in the papers. I'm not a big baseball guy. So I talked about doing psychedelic therapy. So I ended up having a few different media hits done, and then other people wanted to talk to me. Most people actually think Maps got me all my media. They didn't. 90% of my media I got myself. Or it was people contacting Maps to find out how to get in touch with me.
And just for people that don't know, what is MAPS?
The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They were the ones who originally funded the clinical trial I was in. And they were and they were a client of mine for many years, from about 2018 till about 2 years ago.
Yeah.
But so Michael Pollan wrote a book, How to Change Your Mind, about psychedelics. And so when he decided he was going to, do a new one, turn it into a Netflix series, honestly, Michael Pollan's people called me. Same with Gwyneth Paltrow. Like when Gwyneth Paltrow's people call you on your cell phone, it's kind of really weird. And then Business of Drugs, same thing. They had seen me on Goop Labs and a few other like podcasts and things like that. And they're like, we should talk to this guy.
When was your like I've made it sort of moment? Was it like the Gwyneth Paltrow people calling you, or was it was it before that?
No, actually, I'll be honest. It's when Joe Biden signed the NDAA in December of 2023, including the Crenshaw Amendment, because that was a 3-year project.
That's cool.
And Dan mentioned it on the House floor. Part of the reason he got involved in psychedelics is he lived in my building. Funny enough, Zach Rutherford lived across the courtyard from me.
Everybody's near each other.
Oh yeah, I live in the Navy Yard, which is where a lot of House members and staff live.
Yeah.
Part of the reason I live here is when COVID happened, I used to do 2 weeks in Charleston and then a week up in DC. When COVID happened and you couldn't get meetings anymore, so I moved to DC because if you go to the bar or you go to the grocery store, you can still talk to people.
Right. You just as a follow-up on Netflix too. So
Yeah.
3 series, and then recently on Dr. Phil as well, whenever
Yep.
that was. Are you still doing public appearances like that? Are you trying to do more, planning more, trying to do more Netflix series, other movies?
So I mean, if I'm asked, so I usually won't turn down any interviews.
Okay.
Big podcast, little podcast, because
Little podcast. Thank you.
no,
Thanks, John. I appreciate it.
no. But I know people who have like 5 subscribers, and you have more than that. So, but part of it
Everybody
is
starts somewhere, for the record. So we're
exactly
early days. Early days.
once you realize that you should be dead, and there's a lot of people who kill themselves every day. The idea that there's hope of a better day has saved a lot of lives. And this is why I encourage everybody who has a story like mine to share it, because it's a story of hope and living. And that no matter how bad today is, tomorrow can be an amazing day. And so I don't turn down interviews. I try to actually pass off interviews to other participants because everybody's heard my damn story a million times. And so it's good to have new people share their stories as well. I tend to try and focus more on the policy side. That's part of the reason I actually left doing policy stuff with psychedelics, in particular, and now I'm the chief strategic officer at Capital South LLC, which is a lobbying firm. I get to work on a whole bunch of different things in addition to psychedelics, because I like the policy work.
Right. What does that look like for you on a day-to-day basis in DC, just being a lobbyist? And I think there's plenty of stereotypical, kind of there's a
It,
certain kind of vibe that I feel like a lobbyist gives off. And also there's a certain kind of image that I have in my head when I think of a lobbyist, let's put it that way. So what does a day-to-day look like for you though, as a lobbyist
so,
for a psychedelic firm?
so I'm not a lobbyist.
Okay.
I do what's known as strategic communications. So strategic communications is lobbying, grassroots advocacy, and media. Those three things working together to accomplish, you use your grassroots advocacy to get a bill introduced,
Right.
use media to cover the bill being introduced, and then you use the lobbyists to help get the bill passed. And it's this giant circle of how to get everything done. So what I do is I coordinate those things. I come
Got it.
up with new ways to influence, make sure, the people they say that controls the media and stuff. I'm one of those guys. So I talk to a lot of media. I work with lobbyists who go up on the Hill. A lot of what I do is consume as much, like my job will be overtaken at some point by AI when it becomes creative enough. Because I consume as much information as I can, analyze it, and then look at how we can get all our clients working together
Right.
to make everybody, all the client stuff, successful. So a lot of past 2 weeks has been who's going to be Secretary of the Interior, who's going to be USDA, who's going to be SecVA, and trying to figure out what the next Congress is going to look like, who's putting what bills in. But also some of it's very stereotypical. Like I was at the Capitol Hill Club this morning at 9:30, so which is where all the Republicans go hang out. It's their private club.
Right. Do you see yourself being with this firm for a while? Just
Oh
kind
yeah,
of long-term play?
absolutely.
Love it. Love it. I kind of this is totally backtracking, but I've been thinking about this for a minute. When you were actually doing the MDMA trials and you were put in this deep hypnosis of sorts, when they were putting you under and you were going to a different place altogether, what were you experiencing during that? Can you
Um,
can
so
can you explain it? Like, is it even possible to explain it?
so MDMA is not an S2A receptor psychedelic, so it's not like doing mushrooms where you go off to a far off land.
No.
You are in kind of a hypnotic state is the best way to explain it. But you just feel really comfortable with everything. And so how it works is you talk about stuff. They started me with what I call the kindergarten questions, which is like, what was the weather like in Iraq? Which the most non-triggering question you can ask about like a trauma, right?
Right.
And I started talking, and then I didn't shut up. And so I talked for a while. I can't tell you how long because I felt like I talked for 2 weeks and 2 minutes. The time really is funky when you're under the influence. So I talked for a while, and then they told me to stop talking, and I put on eye shades, or in my case, I wore dark sunglasses. Um, Closed my eyes, and then just thought about everything I had just talked about, and kind of was able to reprocess a lot of those memories, and not like visually sitting there having a conversation with myself, but I could have a conversation with myself in my head
Right.
and work things out. It wasn't super duper trippy that like what everybody thinks it is. That's more like your LSD, your ayahuasca, your mushrooms.
Got it. Got it. So for those that are dealing with PTSD, looking for a solution, where should they go? Who should they reach out to if they are interested in a psychedelic treatment of sorts?
Well, first things first, in order for, you know, them to be around for a better day, they've got to be here tomorrow. So don't give up no matter how bad it gets. There's a lot depends on your means. Um, you can fly to Costa Rica or Mexico to do mushroom or ibogaine therapy. Um, there's clinical trials in the U.S. There's legal treatment in the Netherlands. Um, there's certain states that are more accommodating, like Oregon.
Right.
Um, but also, all human clinical trials are, I believe it's uh, clinicaltrials.gov. You can just Google, it's the .gov one. And you can search for psilocybin, you can search for LSD, you can search for MDMA, and all the trials and how to apply are there. If for Lycos, it's mdmaptsd.org, although they currently don't have any ongoing trials. If you're a veteran, there's several different organizations that can do retreats, as well as I said, the VA is committed to funding a bunch of research, so that will be expanding beyond the 7 to 10 locations that are currently doing clinical trials.
Got it.
So as shitty as it sounds, a lot of people are going to have to wait, and this is why FDA approval is so important. Because without FDA approval, it's not going to be covered by health insurance. It's not going to be covered by Medicaid, Medicare, VA, or DoD. And that's how 80% of the country gains access to healthcare. And when you're talking about, for example, the Lycos protocol, it has 84 therapist hours. Well, therapist typically charges $150 to $250 an hour. That's expensive as hell.
Yeah.
The most expensive part about psychedelic therapy isn't the drugs. Although the pharma companies get slammed for, you're going to charge money for this stuff. It's the therapy time. And that's why, and therapy has unequal outcomes. And this is where they try to remove the therapeutic component. Matter of fact, one of the heads of the Veterans Mental Health Leadership Coalition, who, by the way, is not a veteran, but one of the few people who gets a paycheck from that organization, he stated that the solution to getting psychedelic therapy to marginalized populations, including veterans, was to remove the therapeutic component and give them street drugs. Yeah, that's what I mean by it's about the drugs and not about actual medicine and the patient. If it's not FDA approved, people won't have access to this.
Got it.
And so that will happen. MDMA assisted therapy will be approved within 5 years. I hate the fact that people have to wait 5 years because they shouldn't have to. But over the next 4 years, interestingly enough, I think the Trump presidency will be very good for psychedelic medicine, but I don't think it's going to be the way everybody thinks and has been talking about it. Because Donald Trump's brother died of addiction. JD Vance's mother was an addict. He wrote a whole book about it.
Yeah.
The idea that they're going to end the drug war is a fallacy. Now, Donald Trump supporting veterans getting mental health treatment they need is something they can both get behind.
Right.
But not if they think it's about hippy dippy bullshit.
What do you think? What do you think they're thinking? Because I honestly don't know how to read Trump at all. JD Vance seems like a very reasonable individual when it comes to things like this.
So
And just
JD
watching him
Vance,
on podcasts and hearing him talk and all the advice, he's a very reasonable, very level-headed individual across the board.
he's also a veteran, and he
Right.
served in Iraq. He's been shelled before. He, I guarantee you, has lost a friend to PTSD and has friends who have PTSD. Just about every veteran can make that statement. So he's also very level-headed. And look, he's a poor Ohio kid who's now vice president. Weird shit is kind of his thing. They made fun of him for it during the campaign.
Yeah.
But I think JD Vance is definitely somebody who, once he understands it, and that we're not talking about going to raves or fish concerts or dancing in the Peruvian jungle, that this is actual medicine, he's going to be on board. As far as Trump, it's funny. He has the most coherent drug policy of anybody in the country. And the words coherent and Donald Trump usually don't go together. But he's against the recreational use of all drugs, to include alcohol and tobacco. However, if you can show him the science and show him that how it'll help people, I mean, he signed the Right to Try Act. So he believes in people having access to things that actually work. So there's definitely,
He just wants to know it work.
Right. Now, the biggest problem that we have in the admin when it comes to psychedelics are the people pushing psychedelics in the admin. Elon Musk, who talks about doing drugs constantly, is not exactly a model for responsible use. Love Elon to death, but they're going to trust him on rockets and AI and efficiency. They're not going to trust him on drugs.
Well, a single person should not be trusted on everything.
Agreed. And RFK Jr., he's great, but he's also a left wing kind of hippie dude who, again, they're not going to trust him when he starts saying, "Hey, everybody should just do mushrooms, and the world would be a great place. Let's dose the water supply with LSD instead of fluoride." You've got to have the right people talking
Hold on,
about it.
but he did not. For the record, he didn't say that. Let's just
No, he did not. I'm sorry.
pull
I'm
that
sorry.
one out. Which
Yeah,
I always find it interesting whenever somebody makes a comment, and I'm like, let's take that back. That actually was
yeah. I
my
don't want to start any conspiracy theories. But
Not that you're
but
going to start it
no,
on the Cameron Brown show, but let's just make sure it does not originate here. Somebody didn't hear
right.
that and think that was the case. Because I've got people all the time to be like, "Oh, well, they'll basically be like, well, Cameron, you're an anti-vaxxer because you weren't 100% pro taking the COVID vaccine immediately when it came out." And I was like, well, because I thought about it and I wanted to think through things and make the right choice for myself, that makes me an anti-vaxxer. But I think vaccines are phenomenal. Honestly, I think there are plenty of great vaccines. However, when a vaccine has not been studied, I kind of want to take my time and see what the research says before we start
Yeah,
taking things. Same thing with psychedelic drugs. I'm not a big fan of psychedelic drugs for recreational use, but if they help to cure PTSD, why not? That's amazing. That's phenomenal. What's wrong with that?
that's what most rational people in this country think. The problem is you have the counterculture. I mean, we're reliving the 60s and 70s all over again.
Yeah,
Um, the counterculture, one, wants to use this for political things. They think that, the number of places that offer therapists that offer integration, you just have to agree with all these woke political stances in order to get integration. Well, if it's approved by the FDA and offered by the VA or covered by health insurance, that's not going to work anymore.
right.
And they want to bring all the other woke alt left counterculture ideas along with psychedelics because, well, it cures veterans PTSD, so you have to do what we say. And, you know, that's not how you get this stuff passed. This is not how you convince Republicans to be on your side by saying, haha, we tricked you.
Right.
You're not going to get Republican support by coming to DC and telling them to their face, this is just about research and funding while you're, working hard to pass decrim legislation in California.
Right.
Because the part of the thing with psychedelics is they want to try and decrim through the states the same way they did with cannabis. They used kids with epilepsy, people with cancer, and veterans who said, if you don't let us smoke weed, we're going to kill ourselves. And none of those people have it covered by their health insurance. And the VA has issued exactly zero prescriptions for cannabis because it was about legalization and not about the medicine side they were talking about,
Right.
which led to, quite frankly, mass exploitation of the patients. And so one of my missions is to make sure that the psychedelic community doesn't do that to the patients and the people who need this. Because it's not like weed where if it's legal, a veteran can go get $200 worth of weed in a month and be okay. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars for the therapy alone.
Yeah. Expensive.
And that should not, and treatment should never be coupled with adherence to political beliefs or, hey, you have to do a fundraising ad. There was I won't say their name, but a veterans organization that takes veterans with PTSD on retreats and does mushroom ceremonies or ayahuasca ceremonies. They took a veteran immediately following the ceremony, still wrapped in a blanket because they were still under the influence, and had them film a fundraising ad for Twitter.
Probably
That's
not a
not
smart
how
move.
they should be.
Yeah. Not a smart move. Um, in regards to psychedelics, just as we're kind of wrapping up this part of the
Yeah.
conversation, what have we not hit on? What are maybe things that you've discussed previously, or maybe you want to share now that we did not discuss or I haven't asked
Well,
for?
actually, you kind of hit on it. All the people who talk about and think they're experts.
Yeah.
Um, there's a lot of information. There's a lot of disinformation. Um, It wasn't big pharma or big insurance that killed psychedelic medicine. It was the psychedelic movement that killed psychedelic medicine because they made it about drugs and psychedelic culture and the counterculture and Burning Man instead of people in lab coats.
Right.
And so, just to reiterate, it's about context. You know,
Well, do you
context
think
of use
people
is
do you think
critically
people
important.
are starting to view it differently because of the fact that we're actually talking about real world problems that we're solving instead of just having a good trip and having a good time?
No, I think the psychedelic movement has given a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. I mean, Massachusetts question four, which was supposed to be regulated use and decriminalization,
Right.
lost by 14 points in progressive Massachusetts. And it's because you've had a lot of negative outcomes. And you had a guy try to crash an airplane. You had a veteran in Washington State pull out a rifle and shoot up a campground. Something that isn't regularly talked about or known. The guy who took a hammer to Nancy Pelosi's husband was a frequent Ibogaine user and likely under the influence of psychedelics at the time. And so when you make it all about Burning Man and hippie culture, people are like, this isn't about medicine. This is a hoax, just like cannabis was. And so, for example, between the FDA advisory committee, which was a whole dumpster fire, and we could do an episode and a half on just the advisory committee, and the FDA's decision was about 6 weeks. The psychedelic space movement under PSFC and New Approach spent millions of dollars on a PR campaign to help to push Congress to put pressure on the FDA to approve MDMA for so it could be used by VA, etc. Not a single MDMA participant was used in that public relations campaign. They brought veterans that had all, used drugs illegally, and none of them were MDMA to go talk to Congress people. And because of that, because it is now viewed that activists are too involved in the science, there's been a chilling effect on Capitol Hill on support for psychedelics.
Because it was approached incorrectly with the
Yeah,
wrong.
because a lot of people think they were had because a lot of people got caught lying.
Well, wouldn't you be upset too if you were in Congress and that were the case?
Oh, absolutely. Which is why I've always been an honest broker. I
Yeah.
tell them the good, the bad, and the ugly, and let them make their own decisions.
Right. Which I feel like, which is what we discussed the entire time, is if we had more of this and
Yeah,
less of that, things might actually get done properly. And or we probably get to the finish line a little bit quicker than obviously what the time it's taken to get here. And we'll continue to. With you mentioned the Crenshaw bill earlier too. Can you kind of
yeah.
delve into that as well? Just give some more information on what Congressman
So yeah,
Crenshaw passed.
so it was originally the Mike Day Psychedelic Research Act. Um, so I actually wrote that bill like 4 years ago now. It was part of I wrote a bill for HHS, a bill for VA, and a bill for DoD. Gave my elevator pitch to Dan in the elevator of our building.
A literal,
Um,
literal
literally.
elevator. That's all.
Um, and he put me in touch with his office, a great guy in his office, Colin. Um, and he's like, "Send me what you got." So I sent it over, and Dan wanted to do the DoD one. And what it does is it requires the Department of Defense to commence human clinical trials involving MDMA, psilocybin, ibogaine, 5-MeO-DMT, and other plant-based compounds, which is how you say ayahuasca without freaking out Congress. Um, for PTSD and TBI, with the goal of returning people to duty instead of retiring
Right.
them. And then we got 10 million to fund it in the 1.3 trillion dollar minibus, which is still shocking. Um, and I'll tell you, the stuff when you asked when I felt like I'd made it. Honestly, it's when I got that bill passed. In part because nobody in the psychedelic movement thought it could be done. They all wanted other bills, most of which were loopholes for decriminalization, which Congress saw right through. I just went for a straight bill that made sense.
Love it.
And then, with Crenshaw's office and other offices, work the process.
So lesson of the day, put yourself in an apartment complex near people that have positions of power and make your elevator pitch.
Always
Um,
have an elevator pitch ready. You never know, especially in DC. If you're at the Capitol, you can get on any elevator with anybody.
so this kind of leads us into the second half of this conversation, which I the psychedelic side of things too. I think there's a lot of information, a lot of things that I'm still very interested in learning about from you. And I've got a lot of research to do personally at this point, just with the stuff we've discussed. I didn't grow up really smoking weed or doing much of anything. Just wasn't a thing I did. And so now it's like at this point in my life, I'm learning more about drugs and the impacts that they're having on our lives. I think a lot of that once again came from COVID. So I personally have a lot of research to do just to better understand all of this across the board. But I appreciate you giving so much detail on it as we kind of lead into the second half of this conversation. But that also we could have gone on for 2 more hours easily on psychedelics, I feel like.
Oh,
Just
absolutely. And
phenomenal.
it's funny working with the counterculture and the alt left was
Yeah.
so frustrating. That's part of why I started going to Ukraine, because going to a war zone was more relaxing than dealing with the hippies.
That's a wild statement.
It is, and they get very upset when I tell them that. But it's the truth.
So, so what was it? So obviously you've been in Ukraine back and forth. What was the main reason other than what you just said? What was the main reason you decided to go to Ukraine in the first place? Was it literally just
So so had a friend of mine, Adam Eidinger,
that?
who's a big hippie. Um, Said, "Hey, we're bringing a bunch of hippies, and we're going to go help Ukrainian refugees. Do you want to go to Moldova?" I'm like, "Fuck it, why not?" Um, Part of that's because the escalation happened February 24th, 22.
Hmm.
My dad passed October 6th, 2021. 100% Polish, very proud to be Polish. Always talked about, going to Poland because my great grandparents are the ones that emigrated, and he never made it there. So I made a promise when he died that I was going to go within 12 months. And then Ukraine got invaded. My buddy called me and I said, "Sure, I'll go to Moldova, but if we do a second trip, I want to go to Poland."
Right.
And I told him why. He's like, "Okay, cool." So I went for the trip, found out part of the reason he wanted me to go is uh, so there's a section of Moldova called Transnistria, which has 1,600 Russian troops in it. Moldova is not a NATO country, and he knew he could drop me at the border and be like, "Figure it out." So I did. Me and my teammate went to Chisinau and worked about a week with a bunch of refugees, helping them out. Um, and then came home 3 weeks later, went back to Poland. The group I was with wanted to spend like 4 days helping people and then the rest of the 2 weeks touring Poland. And I'm like, that's not why I'm here. So I stayed for a month and started doing my first trips into Ukraine then. Uh, and then after that, I've been going straight into Kiev. Um, and actually, December of 22, I spent 6 weeks down on the front lines, um, like getting shot at and shelled, passing out Christmas presents and food packages, um, which was the first time I was able to actually prove how well MDMA assisted therapy works. Because, if it's a rape victim or a domestic violence
Yeah.
victim, you can't be like, "Hey, go date a douchebag and get your ass beat to see if you're going to relapse."
Right.
But I realized I had the skill set and the ability to go down to the lines and see if I would relapse. And I didn't. And then in 2023, we got the caucus and we got the Crenshaw Amendment passed.
Right.
I mean, I was 2 kilometers from the zero line 3 weeks ago.
So just to kind of dive into that, and I know there's certain things that you want to keep kind
Oh,
of
I
thinking.
work on psychedelic policy in Ukraine too, and I'm getting a bill passed this month.
Yeah, nuts.
I have a
I'm
weird
trying
life,
to I'm
dude.
trying to follow up with like a good not even a good question, but just like trying to figure out where to take it from here. Because first and foremost, that's kudos to you for not only taking the trip and helping, but also going to the next level, taking it to the next level and going to the front lines where obviously you're not required to do that. It's not your country. You're going to help, and I think that's all the time when people see things on the news where it's like somebody from Canada or somebody in Ukraine. or somebody from another country dies in Ukraine, and you're like, what was going through that person's mind when they thought, I need to go to Ukraine and help them to defend themselves from this invasion? And it also goes back to my question about, the US's role in all of this and how we obviously discussed earlier, it's a very gray area. So considering you think this is, the US plays such a there's a gray area of sorts here, right? And we're still trying to figure out what the US's role really should be. And a lot of people disagree with the war altogether and our involvement. And some people agree with it 100% and think we should fight till the very end of every last Ukrainian, right? Uh, where do you kind of stand on that? And also, why do you think it was necessary for you to go and get involved on the front lines in this particular war specifically?
So one, it's rather interesting because you mentioned a Canadian. Um, I know the Canadian you're talking about. His name was Tonko. He was actually a friend of mine. And he had kind of a rough life, did some bad things, nothing major, but like he felt he had amends to make, and he went to Ukraine and he helped rebuild schools and he delivered food packages and he drove ambulances, and he was a truly amazing human being. Um, but he went because he felt he needed to do some penance. Um, and there might be a little bit of that for me, considering I served in Iraq. But the happy moments for me from Iraq was always helping the kids. I realized the invasion in Ukraine happened in 2014. And so when these areas I go down to in the Donbass, every kid under the age of 10 has known nothing but war. And so when I was growing up, I was abused by my mom. And one of the things when I was a really little kid, crying myself to sleep, I always said if I was in a position to help kids that were being hurt, I would. And so a lot of the stuff in Ukraine, I go over, I make friends, and then I help where I can. And one of the things, because being a loadmaster in the Marine Corps, as well as my civilian job between the Army and the Marines, I did logistics. So I do a lot of logistics and warehouse stuff over there.
Right.
Actually, I own a warehouse in Kramatorsk that's used as a logistics hub. We store a bunch of medical supplies, food, whatever. That way we can have things delivered by a tractor trailer, which is cheaper. And then it gets broken down into like sprinter vans and things like that. But I felt a duty to serve. And why Ukraine? Honestly, the Polish connection.
Okay.
And it turns out after my second trip, I was looking at getting Polish citizenship through Ancestry. So I'd get an EU passport, which would solve some like visa issues and allow me to go to Ukraine more. And it turns out that I was always told that my mom was 50% Polish. Well, it turns out actually she's 50% Ukrainian. Um, because my mom was Jewish, and so my family was actually chased out of Ukraine during the pogroms in 1905. Which is interesting because now there's a Jewish president, and I go back and I help the people who threw my family out. There's a lot of deep shit over there, but I do love the country and I love the people. So that's the personal reasons why I like to go. As far as U.S. policy, one, I'm against cluster munitions for everybody. I don't think we should have sent them because they're going to be pulling bombs, mines, and cluster shit out of that country for the next 100 years. I also don't think we should have sent F-16s. I think we should have sent hundreds of thousands of drones. I don't know if we're learning the lessons we should be learning in this because, we went the past 20 years doing asymmetric warfare. Now we're in large scale combat. That's a totally different thing. There's trenches. It's like fucking World War I down there, where you got trenches and artillery and no man's land, and it's fucking crazy. And then you got drones fucking zipping by and blowing people up.
Not even to cut you off, but do you feel like also on a daily basis, I can go to Instagram, I can find an account, and they're sharing this on a daily basis, and they're sharing their Telegram, their Discord communities, right, where a lot of this stuff is being shared openly. Do you feel when you come back and you talk to people about it, do you feel like people are desensitized just across the board because of the fact that it's being shared so openly? Or
I don't think I think people, I wouldn't say desensitized.
Okay.
I don't think they believe it. I think everything is so fake. They they never know what's real and what's disinformation. So the truly horrendous things that you'll see on TikTok or something, honestly, whether it be Ukraine, Gaza, or something else,
Yeah.
people are like, that can't be real.
It's almost though, to that point though, you see it so often. You see Gaza completely leveled. You see all these videos online from the front lines in Ukraine, and you're kind of like it to your point, it kind of doesn't feel real. It's like you see it so often, but that's why I say desensitized because you see
But
it so
remember
often.
back to COVID and the COVID protests and like all the some of the BLM protests and other stuff where you would see on the news all these protesters, and then you see a guy who took a shot from like 10 feet back, and it's like 12 people, but
Yeah.
because they all got tight in. So it's like, okay, like it's funny because the opposite's also true. One of the things I've been working on is trying to get therapists trained in psychedelic therapy in Ukraine.
Okay.
Men of a certain age are not allowed to leave the country. So if the training's done in Poland or the training's done in Serbia, then or Bosnia, wherever the hell Serbia was, male therapists, which is most of your therapists in the military, can't get trained. So I've been working with this coalition of different groups that is trying to get psychedelic therapy into Ukraine. I'm like, we can do the training right across the border. The men can stay in the hotels on the Ukrainian side at night. We can do the training on the Ukrainian side. And then the people who don't want to stay in the Ukrainian side can walk across the border and stay in a hotel on the Polish or Slovakian side.
Right.
And people are like, but that's dangerous. Because people think that like the war is going on in every square foot of Ukraine. Western Ukraine, like Lviv, except they've gotten hit a couple of times recently, but they'll pull you over for speeding. It's normal. Kiev is primarily normal, except for when the air raid sirens go off.
So what
You,
are some of
you,
like the biggest misconceptions here, just across the board with the war, with what you obviously experienced while you were there versus what we see media, online, etc.
most of the country, so a lot of people fled and a lot of people have come back, in part because the war lasted longer than people thought, to include America. Um, and I actually think Joe Biden should have done a lot of things differently before February. Putting a NATO no-fly zone over the Donbass would have forced Putin to shoot down American jets, and he's not going to do that. Um, Instead, Biden basically said, "Hey, we're okay with you taking some land. We're not going to do anything." He was predictable, same as Harris. This is where Trump's going to be different, and I don't think Trump's just going to hand Putin the keys to Ukraine
No.
because Donald Trump, who values winning above all else, is not going to take an L for a war that he views Joe Biden as starting that is going to end up worse than the Afghan withdrawal.
So those that view Trump as an extreme isolationist because he wants to pull out of these wars. So this is obviously the argument, right? Extreme isolationist because he wants to pull out of these wars and bring resources back, right?
Well, one, he's only
Well,
talked about pulling out of one war.
correct. Which is what once again the ending of but the heart the thing that frankly just frustrates me because the conversation about ending a war upsets people. That for me is ludicrous. That's just my opinion, right? But to talk about ending a war is like equal to isolationism, and that for me is frustrating because there's obviously it's very gray, right? But also at the end of the day, saving lives, preventing further death helping people to reclaim their livelihoods, et cetera, seems like the right next step, right? Now,
Well, and let's look throughout history. Um, during the entire Cold War,
yeah,
well, most of the Cold War, the U.S. president and the Soviet premier had channel. Sometimes it went through ambassadors. Sometimes it was direct phone calls. Um, you look at Vietnam. We were in peace talks for most of that war. I see nothing wrong with having peace talks. part of the issue is, you look at World War II, we didn't get into peace talks because that was about complete and total destruction of the enemy.
Right.
You know, Qatar just recently said they're going to no longer host peace negotiations between Hamas and Israel. So those negotiations have in theory been going on. There's been nothing when it comes to Ukraine. It's just feed them more weapons. Um, and I get the logic behind it. I get what they're trying to do. I just find it disgusting because it's costing a lot of people I know their lives.
Yeah.
And, you know, they figured out that sending Ukrainians off to die is a lot more acceptable for Americans. Um, I think the Ukrainians are ready for the war to end. Now, here's part of the big fear of the Ukrainians. In 92, they agreed to give up their nukes in exchange for this not happening, and it
Yep.
did.
Yep.
And what's going to happen in 5 years? Is Putin going to roll tanks again? What, if they're not part of NATO, if there's not something built in, if we don't have peacekeepers in Ukraine, what's going to stop Putin from trying it again?
Well, they're definitely not going to be allowed to join NATO, right? And also, they're not going to be allowed to have nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So
Why?
that's what I'm saying. So I feel like that's going to be a part of the agreement, right? Like if they're going to come to an agreement, I don't feel like Russia's going to agree to that personally, especially after 1992, and especially with the fact that
Well, part of it depends on how U.S. exits. One of the things that could look, Donald Trump's a wild card.
no,
It's the madman theory, which is great, and why he didn't start any wars while he was president. Um, and everybody seems to forget that he sent Javelin missiles and shit. We impeached him for that stuff,
yeah,
and then suddenly everybody turned against it. Um, but Trump could say we can't honor our 92 commitments, so we're here. Here's 15 nuclear warheads. You guys go play. And here's the thing: that offer may be a public offer,
right,
or it may be just what the U.S. says when Zelensky and Putin are meeting to try and hammer something out. Look, hammer it out, or this is the option.
right. So do you think literally day one? I mean, when do you think with Trump getting into office? I mean, January 21st, January 25th. What day is that going to be that things really start to shift? Because I feel like the
I so so
narrative is
so I
already starting to change a bit.
I think part of it depends on there's a long time between now and January 20th.
Yep.
I mean, we just had an intermediate range ballistic missile used in Ukraine.
Which
God
suddenly
knows.
seemed like they're ramping up. The narrative seems to be slightly changed. Well, the commentary, but the narrative seems to be slightly changing. But the actual aggression, the kinetic part of it is actually increasing.
So part of it is, how do you carve up the land?
Yeah.
Like, there's no way Ukraine's getting Crimea back. I wish they did, but there's a lot of historical reasons for that. And military. One of the best things Ukraine did was take a big chunk of Kursk, because now they can trade that for chunks of the Donbass. And so part of this is Trump is not going to accept anything that gives Putin a win. He'll give him a draw, but not a win, because if Putin wins, Trump loses.
Yeah.
And Trump respects Putin and Kim Il Jong and all these dictators because he wants to be viewed as a strong leader. Donald Trump does, more than anything. Bowing down and handing Putin a win is not on the radar. Now, do I think that's going to mean we send tons of weapons? No, I think it's going to be the U.S. applying different types of diplomatic pressure.
Yeah.
If you go back, Mike Waltz wrote an op-ed in December of 2023. He's our new national security advisor. He talks about a lot of things. Russia's making money off the war because they're selling look, Russia is a gas station run by mobsters. That's pretty much what it is. And so, um, because of that, they're selling all their gas to China. who's then selling it, refining it, and then selling it to countries that want Russian gas for cheap.
Right.
Well, we can go after the countries that are buying it, which allows us to screw with China, which Trump absolutely wants to do. We can cut off the money supply to Putin. That applies a lot more pressure for negotiation. Now, the problem there is that's going to take 6 months to a year. Do I think negotiations will start? Probably within 30 to 60 days after Trump's sworn in. But one of the other things that a lot of people haven't thought about is, so Iran and Russia are working together. So we have two fronts of World War III. China's involved and pushing Russia, but this is because China, I believe, and I believe they're correct, when Putin dies, or if he's overthrown, Russia will cease to exist as we know it and will be split in half, and the eastern part will go to China.
I have not heard that theory yet. Is that
Take a look at a map.
Most
people forget that Russia and
just
Japan
curious, is that something that
border.
other people have mentioned as a possibility as well, or is this like a personal thing, just like inner
It's a
dialogue?
personal theory I've had for a while, but I'm not the only one talking about it.
Who else is talking about?
I can't remember, but honestly,
Okay.
off the top of my head, I can't remember any names. But
Okay. I mean, I'd say that's one of the more wild theories I've heard in a while. So I love wild theories, though.
well, part of it is, Russia's mostly thought of as a European country, and they forget that Japan and Russia share a border.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got a map right behind you. Think of how big Russia is, and so China wants to expand.
Yeah.
They want to expand their sphere of influence.
Sharing a border, not Japan and Russia. Yeah.
No, I mean Japan and Russia share a border
too, as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So China wants to expand. I mean, and I don't know what's going to happen to Russia when Putin's gone. Who's going to step up and replace him? He's killed everybody else. Well, okay, he didn't kill them. They accidentally fell out a window.
Who is the woman that the man died, but his wife is now running? What's her name?
Oh, I forgot her name. I can't pronounce anybody's names.
Yeah, I mean she's Russian, so it's right.
Yeah, I mean it's even in Ukraine. I'm like, I don't even understand your alphabet, and my tongue does not twist that way.
But she's
you got her and Medved, but Medved is not strong enough.
Alexei Navalny.
Yeah.
Yep. She's a widow of Yulia.
Yeah, but I don't know if she's. So if that happens, like that's going to be a power struggle between Putin loyalists and Navalny loyalists, which is going to cause a civil war. And if there's a civil war, China will roll straight up into Eastern Russia and say, we're in control now. I mean, I'm curious if that's their play rather than Taiwan. Making you think now.
I have not considered that at all. I mean, which is also why whenever somebody says like when things are going on over here, the actual play is happening here. And whenever you think about it, you're like, oh, that's such a conspiracy. But then you're like, wow, I can see
one thing to
much
realize
bigger land grab, like much bigger resource grab across the board. I mean, and especially with where, I don't really know the amount.
And the U.S. is entirely staged to protect Taiwan and a major naval battle, which is why we haven't really cared about sending all our shit to Ukraine, because the odds of the U.S. getting involved in a land battle with China, we believe because we'll be protecting Taiwan, are slim to none. Well, what happens if that's not the play? And the thing with China to realize, and authoritarian governments have this ability. We have 2-year plans, elections to elections. Donald Trump realistically only has 18 months to get done what he wants to get done.
Yep.
China has 5-year plans, 10-year plans, 25-year plans, 50-year plans. And this is how they can, going back to fentanyl and the opiate epidemic. Yep. We have two separate opiate epidemics that everybody think are linked, and they really aren't. You had the opiate epidemic due to prescription opiates, and we took care of that. And then we started flooding the market. The market started getting flooded with fentanyl. And it's not just being put in heroin. Nobody does meth or cocaine to go to sleep. It's in every single white powder, It's being put into chocolate bars, and it's random.
So back to this real quick.
Yeah, sorry.
You think no, and I'm not even get off the drug thing. Just you think so. Your thought process is that China is basically gearing up to. Are you thinking a blitzkrieg of sorts? Once this happens in Russia, they take over half of Russia. They also take over Taiwan at the same time. Just kind of start full. That's all out World War III at that point. But also a strange kind of
I don't
backdoor
think
into
it'll be.
Russia.
I don't think it. Yeah, I don't think it'll be a blitzkrieg. What I think will happen is, so if there's a so, I kind of wish that like I had a map of Russia behind me.
Big map back here if you want to point to
Yeah.
it. So not the
Well,
best one, but
so part of it has to do with there's not a lot of people in the middle.
yeah.
Okay. There's also not a lot of people on the East Coast, like Vladivostok and that type of area.
Yeah.
If there's a civil war, it will be concentrated around Moscow and the European part of Russia. China won't do a blitzkrieg. They don't really need to roll tanks. They need to roll jeeps with police officers saying, Russia can't control this area. So, for the safety of the people, we're going to take over the duties of law enforcement and ensure that people's rights are protected. And oh, by the way, you're now part of China.
Also, isn't it
It'll
like
be a slow roll, like Belt and Road type thing.
isn't it like
They may even
60% of Russians' population is in Moscow? Or like it's like a really high percentage is in Moscow? Like the vast
well,
majority of the population.
not Moscow, but Eastern Russia, yes.
Yeah. But like we just like population center. It's like obviously there's a lot of people in Moscow, but Eastern Russia in general. So
Yeah. So like Stalingrad or whatever the hell that's called now, Moscow, St. Petersburg, your eastern cities is where all their people live. And then you've got some in Vladivostok, which is the biggest city on the east. Um, but like they've got a lot of land, but not a lot of people. That's why they send all their
Eastern
bad people,
or Western cities?
or sorry, Western cities.
Western
Sorry,
cities. Yeah, okay. I was about to say, I was just
Eastern Europe,
as I'm
Western
pulling up a
cities.
map, I'm like, I'm pretty sure the vast
Yeah,
majority of the left.
yeah, it's because it's in Eastern Europe.
But Eastern, you were referring to Eastern Ukraine earlier too, so just making sure.
Yeah.
Cool. But yeah, I mean, the vast majority of these cities are in the west of Ukraine or of Russia, so that would make total sense.
And here's something else
Where
that
does Mongolia stand in all this? Just curious.
um they're somewhat of a vassal state of China,
Yeah.
for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
But here's something interesting to talk about, that a misconception about, especially amongst the right, about Ukraine, that they're all Nazis. I'm sure you've probably heard this. So one, in the beginning,
So
so
real quick,
this is
in Western Ukraine,
in Eastern Ukraine,
in
or
Eastern Ukraine.
or they just say Ukraine's a Nazi country and all this
Yeah.
stuff. A Nazi country electing a Jewish leader, yeah, that works. But a lot. So when they initially got invaded in 2014, all of their hillbilly rednecks ran to go fight, and a lot of them were far right Nazis, like legit Nazis. It's Eastern Europe; they got legit Nazis. Another part of it is some of the symbology is symbols they've been using in Ukraine since before the Nazis. The Nazis used those symbols because they were well known in Eastern Europe. They were runes. You also have to look at Ukrainian history. Before we knew about the Holocaust, there was the Holmendor, which killed 10 million Ukrainians. The Soviets starved them to death. This happened in the late 1930s. And so, because of this, when the Nazis rolled tanks into Ukraine, they viewed the Nazis as liberators. They didn't know about the Holocaust. They didn't know they were evil people. They knew that these weren't the Soviets who were starving them to death.
Right.
And this is when you have two extreme ideologies going to war with each other, and you have to pick a side. So, if South Carolina and North Carolina's coast got invaded, all the rednecks in the entire country that have arsenals in their basement would run towards it. And a lot of them would be white supremacists. But you know what? Russians killed a lot of them. They're not around anymore. And Azov Battalion, yeah, they're not, they've done a lot to get rid of all those people. And I know this because I work with Azov Battalion. And I'll tell you, they're not Nazis. Like I said, my mom's Jewish. They don't have an issue with me,
Yeah.
but you hear that they're Nazis. You hear that they're going after the church. One of the things people don't realize about the Russian Orthodox Church, there is no separation of church and state. And so the priests typically work for FSB. And if you've got a spy center set up in a church, yes, they're going to go raid it.
Right.
Same as we would. Um, there's a lot of there's a lot of people on the right that very much support Putin, and I don't understand why. Other than
Do you think
Hunter
it's that they
Biden.
support? Do you think it's that they support Putin, or they support isolationism, nationalism, bringing things back to America and stop and yeah, and keeping the money out of other countries, for giving
Well,
debt
yeah,
to,
yeah,
I just say it's like I just don't want to mistake like for like supporting Putin for removing people or removing resources from another country when
well, this
a
is
lot of
why
people think
when
things should be
yeah.
done better here. Just that's I feel like that's more the argument than supporting Putin personally, but maybe some people do.
Oh
And
no, I see a bunch of people on the right, up here in DC,
got it.
that like it's not hard to say like if it's isolationism. When I say one of the questions I ask when people start saying we shouldn't be sending money to Ukraine, I'm like, okay, but do you think Ukraine has a right to defend itself? Which is two separate questions.
Yep.
And it's a lot of I've heard a shocking number of people who are like, well, it used to be Soviet, so Putin should be allowed to take it if he wants. I'm like, so are the Baltics.
Yeah, I don't know if I ever told you that. I studied in Estonia, in college, and so that was
Dude, the Baltics, but almost everybody I run into is Estonian in fucking Ukraine. The Estonians and like the Baltics are terrified and doing everything they can to help fucking Ukraine.
100%. Well, I mean, that was every single person in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Every single time we talked about Russia was just like it's a constant preparation for a war with Russia. This was back in 2016, 2017. Constant preparation for war with Russia. And obviously here it's come to fruition. And I mean, obviously Crimea was before that, but things are happening, right? And it's all starting to happen right in front of our eyes. Whereas these people have been talking about it obviously for their entire lives. That's all they've ever known is preparation for war with Russia. Whereas like Estonia is obviously very cyber based, right? And a lot of them are because it's frankly
So is Ukraine actually.
right. I'm saying that's a lot of their protection, right? A lot of their stuff is it was not so much, being able to prepare for conventional warfare. It was very much so hybrid warfare of sorts, and they were
Like, there's
preparing
not
for
a
it.
lot of Estonians. They can't have that big a fucking army.
Right.
Like,
But they're all super young too. Anybody in leadership, well, they're getting older, but they are still super young.
yeah.
Um, so very tech focused, very cyber focused, and saying, hey, we'll take down your cyber infrastructure as our form of supporting the war efforts. So
Well, and this is also where, it's not just a ceasefire, it's what happens after the ceasefire because foreign entities, to include US companies, will not invest in rebuilding Ukraine unless there's some form of guarantees of protection.
right.
Um, and how you guarantee those protections with somebody like Putin, who knows? Because do they think that Trump can get a ceasefire? Yes. I think a lot of people know that that will happen. What that's going to look like and what the details are is totally up in the air. But what happens when he's not in office? What happens when you don't have the madman theory anymore? What happens if somebody like Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, an establishment Democrat, comes in? What if it's Gavin Newsom? Then what happens? What does Putin do? Because they know Putin's still going to be there. Trump only has 4 years, although he did troll the press and the Democrats by saying he might go for a third term at the GOP meeting.
He is the ultimate.
I love it. It's so fun to watch.
Yeah,
And
it's
they don't realize when they're getting trolled.
they don't get it, and it's hysterical to watch. It's also hysterical to see, like, well, the people like Elon on Twitter and the tweets and some of these things that are hysterical. Also, like Joe Rogan being called a dragon believer recently. I'm not sure if you saw that or not. On the View
Yeah.
portrayed him
Oh
as a
yeah.
dragon
Although
believer.
I will say, and this is a statement I never thought I'd like ever say on a podcast.
Yeah.
When Joe Rogan talked about psychedelics, he was wrong. It wasn't big pharma, and
What
it
was
wasn't
his
big
What was his
insurance.
statement?
Well, no, he said that big pharma and big insurance blocked it because it's a medication that works. And to be honest, like, not to go off on a tangent,
Yeah,
but big pharma is waiting in the wings. They're a problem in psychedelics in the next step. If any entity can show you can take a Schedule One narcotic through FDA approval,
big problem.
they will dump billions into buying companies and doing research because they want to own the patents for the next 20 years on all these compounds. They're waiting. They're not helping, but they're not hurting. Insurance, insurance will gladly pay, say, 50 grand up front for a 4 month protocol I went through for a 70% chance that they won't have to provide medicine and therapy for life for their insured. It makes them money to heal people.
Right. Right. So for
But Joe
the
Rogan was wrong on that. But
well, I guess he's not. I guess he's not always right about everything. But I also do feel like to a certain degree, when you speak in
he
that
is right
space,
about dragons, though.
he is right about dragons. I think everybody putting Dragon Believer on their profile is now like an obligation of sorts. If you're going to be a public figure, you're a Dragon Believer. Um, but back to Ukraine real quick, and just kind of
Yeah.
finalize this part of the conversation. What do you think the best next step is, just across the board for the U.S. and the U.S.'s involvement in Ukraine?
So
Like utopian world, what obviously war ends, but like, what do you
I
think?
mean, short term within the next couple months would be. I hope Biden shoves as much weapons into Ukraine as he can. Um, I think that you NATO's going to have to reimagine itself. You already have now Europe talking about a coalition of the willing. Most people don't seem to realize Poland has the biggest military in Europe, except for Russia,
Yeah,
because Poland's been invaded a lot, and they're like, no, never again.
yeah,
Um, but I do think that Europe should pull more of its own weight. I mean, you hear the left talking about, well, Europe, every country has, national health care. Well, yeah, because they don't have to pay for a military like we do to protect everybody. And this is where I don't think Trump's really an isolationist. I think there's isolationist people around him.
yeah.
I think he just wants everybody to pay their fair share. And the U.S. has been lifting the heavy burden for decades. And so I think a good thing long term is going to be potentially a reimagining of NATO, um, or at the very least, having a European coalition that is going to support Ukraine more from the European side. Because one of the big problems NATO has right now is they have one member that is siding with the enemy in the two major conflicts that we have going on,
Right,
which most people don't seem to know. Because Hungary's siding with Putin and Turkey is siding with Hamas.
right.
So what happens when, say, I don't know, Turkey starts supplying arms to Hamas and Hezbollah, and Israel, our ally, attacks Turkey?
Or we find out about it,
Yeah.
becomes public knowledge. Yeah, it'll certainly make things interesting.
Well, and this is part of the problem when you have 70-year-old treaties. Countries change. Turkey is no longer a secular Western country. Hungary is no longer, a democracy loving, Western country. So if NATO is meant to protect Western democracies, then why don't we have it be Western democracies and you can get kicked out for doing stupid shit?
Right, absolutely. Um, of all the things you've seen in Ukraine and experienced in Ukraine, not what's the most wild, what's the most crazy, but what has been like the biggest takeaway for you personally? Like biggest takeaway from this entire experience. And obviously you've had plenty of them, but what really go, I mean, what do you think of like your experiences going back and forth to Ukraine and obviously the complexity of geopolitics and all that goes on in the world all the time? What really comes to mind for you?
How much better the world could be if people would just take a little bit of their time to help other people that they may not know or may never be able to help them.
You think people in the U.S. can do a better job of being involved without being involved, if you know what I mean? Helping without trying to get too involved. And I'd say that obviously there's certain individuals and people that need to get very involved, but I feel like there's a lot of people that want to help but don't want to, for example, go be
One of
on
the
the front lines.
one of the greatest things that I have seen doing humanitarian aid is most of the humanitarian aid, most of the medical, all this stuff, is provided through donations,
Yeah.
either monetary donations and then things are bought, or just sending. My last trip, I brought a giant bag that was filled with tourniquets and chest seal. Lots of people can help. If you don't think America, I view what I'm doing as being a good libertarian. I don't think the US should be helping in the ways that they are, but that doesn't mean I can't help. It's just like if you don't think that the federal government should be providing food stamps, you sure as shit should go work at a soup kitchen on Saturday,
Yeah.
because saying it's somebody else's problem isn't what America's about.
Right.
And you have the left saying, hey, look, the left is really great at identifying problems. Their solutions suck, but they can identify a problem. And yeah, we're the richest country in the world. Nobody should be starving. And if we want to talk about America first, that means treating our fellow Americans better. And a lot of that is, look, if you think government should be smaller like I do, step up. And, I don't get paid when I go to Ukraine. I completely self-fund all my trips. Now, the fact that as a retiree, I get to fly for free from Baltimore Airport to Ramstein, Germany does make it a little easier.
Definitely helps.
But, going over there and handing out, food packages to a village, or going and seeing my warehouse being used. I know that sounds weird. Or going and resupplying surgical points. One of the surgical points that down in the Donbass that I support, this one's about 10 kilometers from the lines. When I was there, I found out that they were losing a lot of patients because they were losing blood. And I'm like, okay, so what do you need to do blood transfusion? And there was basically a checklist from the Ukrainian government that if you had these things, they'd send you blood. They needed some mobile freezers and some freezers for the stab point. That's it. And because of the exchange rate, it was like $400. So for $400, I bought some freezers so that they could get blood. And they saved over 100 lives in the first 2 weeks.
Wow.
So if we're talking, so that's one of my big takeaways, is that if everybody helped more, we wouldn't need government. Then nobody would have to say, hey, look at this person starving on the street.
Are there certain organizations that you would say, hey, this is a good one to donate to? Like they're actually doing with the money what they say they're going to do?
I work with a group called Frontline Medics, and I'll send you the link.
I'm going to drop it in the show notes as well.
Perfect. Yeah, it's frontlinemedics.org.
Okay.
And there should be a donate button somewhere on the webpage.
So it sounds like it's $400 goes a really long way. Properly.
Oh, absolutely. It's
into
small.
the right
This is because of working in politics is a lot of going out in happy hours and bar tabs in DC. Like, I can buy an entire bar, a round of beer in Ukraine for $12, and a bar tab for me for a night in DC is like $200. So I
like 5
save money
drinks.
by going to Ukraine because everything's just so inexpensive. I spent 3 weeks at a 5-star hotel with a sauna and like a jacuzzi in my freaking hotel room for $600. So I do well,
In
and
in Kiev? In Kiev?
in Kiev, yeah. And I buy a lot of stuff when I'm over there. I pay for a lot of operational expenses because
Yeah.
it's funny. Everybody wants to buy money, send money to buy tourniquets. Nobody wants to send money to pay for the gas to deliver the tourniquet.
So many different parts of the process.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is where logistics. Part of the reason I got started doing logistics in the warehouse stuff was you have people from all over Europe. I've met a lot of really great people. A lot of people that would never make it in the military, but I consider them brothers just as if they had served next to me in Iraq. But some of them, like, there's a guy running a warehouse, great guy. He left his job in Warsaw to come down and help refugees. He was an insurance salesman. He had no idea how to run a warehouse. And when you're talking about like World Food Kitchen, which is a great organization, You know, cooking food and putting it on a plate and handing it out, anybody can do that.
Right.
When you're talking logistics and like how to properly run a warehouse, so you know the supplies you have, you know what's available, you don't, you know, that takes a skill set. So it's not a skill set that shows up a lot, which is why I'm glad it's not glamorous or fun, but it actually is needed and really helpful to make sure everything gets there as efficiently as possible. Because if you run out of tourniquets, people die.
Right. I once again feel like this conversation could go on for hours. And the next time I'm in DC, I'm buying you a drink, for sure.
And
And
hey, next time I'm down in Charleston, like we can get together and talk more about
no,
different
we're
stuff.
gonna keep the conversation going. And I once again I don't even want to cut this off necessarily, but I do want to wrap it up.
Yeah,
For purposes of saying, hey, we're gonna have another one of these in the next few months, just to kind of recap, just to see where we're at in the world. We're gonna go back through all the above, and once again do a 3 month, kind of 4 month recap of what's happened.
and I'll
Um,
have a few more trips to Ukraine under my belt by then.
and we'll be able to discuss plenty of that. So, with that being said, this is just kind of a general question. I talk about success all the time on this podcast too with different people, and it's not like I mean, I've had you're my 26th episode, right? So it's not like I've had that many people on, but I talk about success a lot and what people perceive as success for themselves, or like what they want to leave behind as their legacy. Like what is the reason they're doing the things they're doing, right? All those are obviously different questions, but kind of as just a concluding question for you, why are you doing all that you do? Like what drives you on a daily basis? And as a follow-up to that, what do you consider to be success
A lot my drive on
in
a
this
daily
crazy life that
basis.
we live?
Uh, a lot of my drive on a daily basis, whether it's here or Ukraine, is I like helping people. It makes me feel good to help people and to do good. Um, it's goofy. I had a weird upbringing. I watched a lot of TV shows, and so my role models are roles in different TV shows. And it, you know, when you're a scriptwriter, it's easy to write, this is how to be a good person.
Yeah.
And so for me, being a good person is important. I also have had a lot of people in my lifetime help me that had no reason to help me. And so for me, I view I'm in a weird position where I already view I've achieved success because I'm alive. And by being alive, by doing everything I do, more people in the future will be alive. And I know that, you know, yeah, it sucks to go get shot at,
And probably
but
not fun, not enjoyable.
but I also know the simple fact that I can do that and come home and not have nightmares and not have PTSD still to this day speaks volumes for the therapy that saved my life. And it provides hope to all the people who have PTSD or who are suffering that, you know, I was there. I pulled the trigger. You know, I slit my wrist. I tried to end my life, and I'm glad that I failed because I wouldn't have the amazing life that I have now had I failed. And so for me, success is honestly being alive.
I love that response. And I appreciate that response. Um, and I think especially with what you've experienced even in the past couple of months, right? Where people are dying on a daily basis, but people die everywhere all the time. But obviously in a war zone, sure, it makes you appreciate things even more so than others.
I've lost more friends to suicide than I've lost in combat. And I've got a list on my refrigerator of 157 people that I know who committed suicide. That's the darker side of working in psychedelics and talking about PTSD. People reach out for help. And this is why I get very angry at like the psychedelic movement, who it was about parties and drugs and Burning Man and being cool and not about helping people. And I've proven what I'm willing to do to help people because I joined the military because I thought I was doing the right thing and I wanted to help people. And I did.
Right.
And now I still go to a combat zone completely voluntarily without a rifle to help people because it's the right thing to do. And by going and helping people in Ukraine, I can come back because I can tell you up on Capitol Hill when I whipped out this video I have me talking to a Ukrainian soldier about PTSD and what I do back home.
Yeah.
And then gunfire starts breaking out in the background and you don't flinch. And you go show that to a congressman or a congresswoman or a staffer. They're like, well, okay, I guess this works. This isn't just hippie mumbo jumbo. And like I said, there's a higher power that has aligned a lot of very strange things for me to be able to fill this weird niche in history. But it also all stems back from I was a little kid who was hurting, who wanted to make sure if he was in a position to help, he would.
So I lied. I'm not going to conclude with that last question. I'm going to conclude with the higher power question. This one in particular has, I think there's a lot of people that consider it to be a day-to-day discovery of sorts. Right? We're constantly trying to figure out what's going on. A lot of people are very religious and they are 100% steadfast in their beliefs. Others are trying to figure it out and believe in a higher power, but ultimately struggle to try to figure out a path to believing in that higher power or really know what's going on. So you said you now believe in this higher power, maybe again. What has, can you kind of delve into that just a little bit more? When you
So
say
it's not
higher
a
power, you
yeah,
mean,
it's not a daily thing. I'm not super religious.
okay,
I very much shy away from organized religion, in part because I saw what Sunni versus Shia divide
mhm,
caused during a civil war in Iraq.
yep,
I see what's going on in Israel and Gaza, which is very religiously motivated.
right,
Um, but I also look at my life and look at how unprobable it is that all the things would line up exactly the way they have for me to have the weird voice that I have. Um, and a lot of it, except for going to Ukraine, was not really a choice. I
right,
didn't choose to get PTSD. I didn't really choose to do MDMA. It's not like I was forced or anything, but I had no other option. I did it because I thought it'd be fun to do MDMA before I died. And so having all those things line up, having a lot of things, I decided, well, might as well just go whole hog on it. Do I believe, like, I don't pray. Unless I will say, if people ask me for prayers, I always say a prayer, whether I believe or not. Um, I don't believe in like talking to God, but there is some guiding hand. Being that both my parents passed, I started looking a bit more into Judaism. Um, I find it interesting because Judaism is basically the history of the Jews getting fucked with because they didn't do the right thing. So I kind of look at all religions and it's all do the right thing. It's all based on the golden rule, you know, and we disagree on how to do that. Well, if we'd stop disagreeing on how to do that and just go help people,
yeah,
look at all the random people in the New Testament that Christ helped that he had no reason to. We should be more like that. Like, no, Christ wasn't saying, hey, give unto Caesar so he can give it unto the poor, you know, but he did say go out and do good works and that we will be viewed by works. And that's one thing that I always used to joke back when I was like agnostic. I would say, if God exists and I do good works, I should be judged on those and not whether I bent the knee to it. Because that's pretty much been the message. Did Jesus really say worship me or did he say do good works in my name?
right.
And I envy people who are more religious than I am. And the thing that really made me question things, so for example, believing in a higher power doesn't mean I believe in heaven or hell. In part because I work in drug policy, my dad died not thinking I was a success and that I was just a near homeless weed addict in DC, which is funny because nobody's a near homeless weed addict. Like make it meth or heroin or something real. But he died disappointed in me because he didn't understand what I did. Everybody told me after he died, well, he's up in heaven now looking down and he knows the truth. And I just couldn't believe that. That doesn't mean I don't believe that there's some weird divine intervention in my life. It's been kind of Job like, but hey.
Would you like to believe though that he is looking down from somewhere and or around you still energetically even?
Not like on a daily basis. I view it kind of More like if you've got somebody who like taps on the glass of the ant terrarium, like I don't believe that God is involved in our lives on a daily basis. He may swirl some things around, like, but he also like Donald Trump. He plays golf on Pluto. Like, he's got to go relax.
All I'm saying is there has to be a really good shirt of Donald Trump playing golf on Pluto now. There's like a mug that's going to be Donald Trump playing golf at Pluto. It's going to
And
come out as a line.
he's gonna be as big as Pluto is.
Or it's going to be a meme. It's going to be a meme of some kind. Pluto Trump. Oh my gosh. And it's going to go wild on crypto. Um,
And I am still trying to figure out the believing in a higher power, because that's been kind of a more recent thing.
Well, I won't get into my religious beliefs much, but I've always believed in that higher power, and I think I've gone back and forth, as to how I should believe in that higher power, right, and the direction I should take to believe in that higher power, over time. But I think that everything has always led me back to that higher power, right? There is a source, there is a higher power, there is an existence or a being that is much greater than us, which is for me, very calming and good to know. Good to have, it's good to be able to experience it on a daily basis and think to myself, okay, there is a greater power here at play that is
Well,
aligning
if
things for a greater purpose in some way, shape, or form, right? Whether it's involved in everything, we could have the whole free will conversation too. But I think there is some kind of guidance that is provided when you are born to become something that ultimately has an impact on this universe, that is hopefully an impact that allows somebody else to have an experience that guides us in a certain direction. Now, once again, good or bad, there's good and bad in the world, right? We all know that. But the purpose for this life and this existence is to have an experience and to hopefully provide some kind of impact on the universe that moves it in the right direction.
and that's my plan. And hopefully, this is the weird thing when it comes to psychedelic medicine. If we do this right, this is one of those medical advancements that could fundamentally change humanity going forward forever.
If
You
done
know,
properly.
if done properly. And talking about faith, one of the things, God gave every person free will. It's in all the Bibles. And that's why questioning faith is not wrong, because how do you know you really have faith if you haven't questioned it and you just blindly follow?
Correct. This is the conversation
But
I have with my religious friends all the time. And once again, I'm religious, but I have it with them too, to be like, hey, just because I'm questioning things does not mean I'm not religious. It does not mean that I don't believe in this. It just means that I'm trying to figure out why we believe in this. And I think
how
that's
many Christians, for example, would be Pharisees if it was 2,000 years ago?
would be what?
Pharisees or money changers, the people who
Lots.
went, yeah, and that's part of the issue that I've always had with faith and a higher power
Yeah.
is, and it's funny because for me, I'm working on this new weird philosophy. Basically, most of humanity is trying to find the instruction manual when there really isn't one. You know, things happen and you react.
Just don't stop acting.
Yeah. When you have a decision whether to do the right thing or the wrong thing, do the right thing. I mean, courage, it's been said many times, and it's very true. It's not an absence of fear. It's being terrified and doing it anyway.
Yeah. Well, John, I really appreciate the time tonight. I'm going to go ahead and conclude this on that note. Once again, we're gonna have to do another one in the next 3 to 4 months. It might be
Yeah,
sooner,
it's a great
depending
conversation.
upon which direction things go in the world. Best of luck in your trips and your travels and all the above. Best of luck with the psychedelic movement, the responsible psychedelic movement on Capitol Hill. I think there's a lot of those discussions that need to be had very much more openly across the board, without instant criticism. So I appreciate you for pushing forward on that front, and for continuing to push ideas that the vast majority of the population might not be considering.
I do weird stuff and I talk about stuff that not a lot of people talk about. So,
Wonderful fringe topic conversation.
exactly.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate it and look forward to the next one.
Absolutely.
All right.